Well, we now come to our final session for prophetic genre, and this was entitled Sermon Content. Sermon Content, and we've done this before as well in each of the other courses. And now you're going to compose your sermon content document. And you've composed a sermon content document for an epistle, for a narrative passage, for a poetical passage. Now you're going to write a sermon content document for your prophetical passage. And so when you think about the structure of your sermon content document, there's still no changes. The introduction, the body, conclusion, all the things remain the same. And so I won't go through all of this like I've done before, but all those steps, you can see that on in your notes there. None of that has changed. So just be aware of that it's entirely the same procedure. But as with the other genres, there are some little update and tweaks. So we're still following the same steps, we're still following the same procedure, but there's a few little adjustments that you want to make. And so, again, there's no major changes to the introduction, body, conclusion. When you're preaching from the prophetic genre, use the same steps as you've done before in the epistolary, the narrative, the poetic, and the wisdom genres. So again, all of that remains the same. But there are some minor adjustments that you want to be aware of. And so I want to highlight some of those for you. So it's dealing with certain aspects, certain areas, like we did for the narrative and for the poetic. There's certain areas when you get to that part of, or that specific part in the sermon content document, there's certain areas you just want to be aware of. So number one, when speaking the historical situation, when you're dealing with the historical situation in the introduction, and that could be connected to the poetical or the narrative or a combination of both. The preacher will need to be able to summarize the situation as he is best able to understand it. When it comes to prophetical genre, like for example, if Jeremiah is preaching a sermon, you have to ask yourself, when he's preaching that sermon, he's preaching to a certain group of people. That could be the Jewish people, the people of Israel, or it could be another nation. Sometimes they would preach about another nation, like to Edom or Moab. So when the sermon is done, when the sermon is being preached, let's say, it's just an example. What's going on historically at that time? What are they dealing with? What's going on? What's happening? You got to be able to understand the historical situation. Now, if you're doing the proper exegetical steps, that historical situation, you will have looked at that when you work through your narrative and poetical, analysis. And if you didn't do it then, you will do it at some point. You got to understand the history behind it. But you got to make sure you can explain that. And you don't want to explain it in a way that's boring. You want to be able to kind of tell the story. Kind of be able to take that historical information that you've learned and weave it into a story in some kind of way. Not a make-up story, but put your congregation in the midst of that historical situation. What if they were living during that same time frame? Put them into that situation. Why? Because Jeremiah is about ready to preach. He's about ready to speak, thus says the Lord. And when he speaks his sermon, it's going to address that historical situation. And you want to be able to put people there. You want to be able to make sure your people can feel, not just know, but feel what's happening. Feel what's going on. The time frame of when the prophet was speaking or the events taking place is important information. Zechariah, he's going to go up to heaven. He's going to see visions. And some of these visions are about the future. But he's doing it in that time frame, at that period of time in his history, in the history of the nation. So you got to understand that period of time, especially if there's foretelling involved. If in the sermon or in the passage there's foretelling elements, that speaks to the future, but that's being said at that particular time. Why is it being said at that particular time? Especially like a passage like Daniel 9, which we've looked at in our class. It's a very important passage, and there's a lot of foretelling there. But if you don't understand it within the context, the historical context of what's happening, you lose the whole point of the foretelling elements of it. And so when you're going to preach and you're dealing with the historical situation, and that you get to that part of it in the introduction, You want to make sure you understand what's going on, what's happening, what the prophet is dealing with, what's going on at that period of time. And you want to be able to explain that to your congregation. And not in a way that would bore them and put them to sleep, but a way in which they would be engaged and enlightened and enthused about what they are learning and what you're telling them. That's number one. Number two, when you transition, at the end of the introduction, you're transitioning to the body. You will need to, like we have in the past, you need to explain the verses in the prophetical passage that provide a sort of setup for the verses that officially contain the how statements. Like in my Isaiah 6 passage, the how statements do not begin until verse 8. Verses 1 to 7 is just the setup. It's just the setup material. It's that which is a part of the story, a part of the passage. But most of verses 1 to 8 or 1 to 7, before I get to the how statements and get to the body of the sermon, in verses 1 to 7, I'm going to be talking about all of that after I've read the passage. So it's going to be in that transition step. Here it's important to make sure you walk through each of the setup verses. You got to connect your hearers to what these verses are saying and how it will connect to the how. So the transition in the introduction section is the bridge between the what and the why and the how. And so make sure that you cover the verses that are not included in the how at that point. That's the best way to do this. The how statements is what appears in the body. You got to make sure they understand the verses that lead them to that point, especially if the how statements is not the entire chapter or they're not the entire passage. You got to be able to make sure they're aware of that. And we've looked at that before when we dealt with narrative, especially with narrative passages. Not every verse is in the outline. Not every verse is in the how statements. And some of that is setup, what I call setup. It gets you to that point. It's vital information. You got to explain it. You got to go through it. But it's not a part of the outline. Again, not every verse deals with a how. So you just want to be aware of that when you're in that transition stage in the introduction. Third, when speaking the explanation for each of the how statements, so now we've gone into the body of the sermon. Now we're going through each how statement. You need to make sure that you explain, and this is kind of true of the poetical because sometimes you're dealing with poetry, right? Even in prophetic genre, you got to explain the figurative language aspects that are contained in the text. You got to do that, like you did for poetry. Now, the new addition here is when you have the foretelling aspects. The foretelling aspects, especially when you're explaining those. You've got to explain those. That's why in the synthesis, remember I gave you a date of when that connected to the passage in Isaiah 6? Because I need to explain that to everyone. Isaiah is saying, Lord, how long am I going to have to preach this message that you gave me in verses 9b and 10? That's the sermon you want me to preach everywhere. How long? And he says, until the cities lie without inhabitant, meaning until judgment comes. So when would judgment come? Well, I know the answer to that question. And so when I'm explaining that, when I get to that point in the passage, I got to be able to tell the people the dates. I got to be able to fill in the gaps. I got to be able to explain all the aspects of the foretelling analysis that I learned. I can't just leave them hanging. I know when those cities were lying waste without inhabitant. I know how long it took. And I know that Jeremiah lived to see it. Not Isaiah. He was already dead. Because Isaiah lived many years before Jeremiah. But when Jeremiah was living, he saw it. How desolate is the city. That was his words in the book of Lamentations. So you got to explain those things. Just make sure that you don't forget that. That's the point. And I'm going to emphasize that in our class time together. But you got to provide as much detail as possible. And again, not to be boring and not to try to present it in a boring way. But everything you learn in that foretelling analysis step is crucial because it fills in the gaps for everyone. It helps them to see the connections. of what is being said on that particular day to those particular people, how that the future elements that are spoken in that sermon or that passage, how it all connects back to the present day. It's the same for like 2 Peter. Peter's talking about the future. Peter's talking about a new heaven and new earth, similar to the book of the Revelation. And he talks about how how the present heaven and earth, what we live in now, is going to melt away with fervent heat. It's going to be gone. And there's going to come a new heaven, new earth, where righteousness dwells. And you say, okay, Peter, why are you telling us this? He said, if this is what's really going to happen, and it is, he says, I'm paraphrasing, then what kind of people should we be? That's his point. If we know the future, if we know the future, and we do, God has revealed it to us. We know what's going to happen. We know that this world is not forever. Your cell phone is not forever. Your device is not forever. Your belongings are not forever. You're not forever in terms of this physical life. We get older. We age. So we know the future. How does that affect us today? How does that affect where we live? And so you want to bring in those, when those passages have foretelling aspects to them, elements to them, you want to emphasize that. Fill in the gaps, especially if, from our vantage point, those foretelling areas have already been completed. You know, they've been fulfilled. There are some aspects to foretelling, you know, as we learned, that are still future to our time frame. But you want to make a point of that when you're explaining. So when you're writing your sermon content document and you're writing those explanation statements, make sure you explain all the figurative language and you explain all of the foretelling aspects. Make sure you do that. Now, if you do well in completing all these various exegetical assignments, it's going to help you and you end up with synthesis, primary matters. When you come to the point of writing and composing your sermon content document, you're not going to have a problem. Hopefully you have more on the sermon content document than you could ever say in a sermon. Remember, your sermon content document is not a manuscript. It's not a word for word of what you will say, but it gives you the framework and the structure of what you will say and how you will say it and when you will say it. That's why there's structure to this. So you want to follow the steps. Introduction, body, conclusion. You want to work through the process just as we've been using it for the other genres, the other types of literature that's in the Bible. That does not change. But you just got to be aware of these certain little elements, these certain areas of the sermon content document, and make sure that you don't forget what you need to do, because you want to incorporate that aspect of the prophetical genre that you're studying into the sermon. It's a prophetical passage. It's different than, even though it may be in poetry, there's differences to it than Psalms. So you just want to be aware of that. It goes back to the nature of the genre itself, to what defines that genre. And you want to make sure you bring these things out. So follow the introduction, body, conclusion steps. But remember these areas and don't forget them, and incorporate these things into your writing and compositions. So when we have our class for sermon content document, when we're looking at this, we're going to spend some time, early part of the class, talking about some of these things, and I'll go over the Isaiah passage with you, show you some things from it, because you'll see that example in your notes. And then I'll actually preach the sermon, and you'll evaluate. So that's how we'll spend our time together in class. But hopefully this has been a help to you to get you started. And so we come now to the last video. This is the end of our prophetical genre course. And so pray the Lord gives you blessings as we finish this course and we move on to course number 5. Now in course number 5, there's no videos. So this is the last video that we'll make. Course number 5 is a different kind of course. It'll be all class, lecture, discussion in class. So you got to make sure you show up. And there's a project that you'll work on. So, but for right now, keep working on your sermon content document. Begin working on that. Think through that. We'll have class together. And you want to be working on that to prepare for when you would preach this passage when we have course number 5. So again, let me know if you have any questions. I'm here to help in any way possible Take care, and God bless. And thank you for being on this journey, watching all these videos, hopefully from the very beginning up to this last one. So again, take care, and God bless.